How to service the HP Chromebook 11 MK G9 Education Edition. Hi everybody and welcome. You're looking at the brand new HP Chromebook 11 MK G9 Education Edition. Today I'm going to show you how to take apart this Chromebook so that you can fix any part that you'd like to. So let's start by putting it down on the workbench. I like to use an anti-static mat like this one when I tear down devices. I'd recommend that you use one as well. It's to protect the parts and make them easy to find. Okay, what's first? Ah yes, the tools of the trade. So before we get going, it's a good idea to have these tools on hand. But hang on, I'm going to switch views here so that you can see these tools better. Just a heads up, this won't be the last time I do this switch as we disassemble this one. Okay, the tools. So we need a Phillips screwdriver with a P1 and P0 head. A flat-bladed, non-metallic tool. Tweezers. Needle nose pliers. And a little wooden stick like this one. Okay, so now I'm going to switch back to the wide view because I want to show you where we need to start. You may have opened up a few notebooks or other Chromebooks, and you would probably expect to start by removing the bottom cover. But to get inside this Chromebook, you actually have to remove the top cover with the keyboard. We often call this part the keyboard deck or C-deck, and for this new Chromebook, this is the first part to remove. So put the Chromebook face down and grab your Phillips screwdriver with the P1 head. Let me change views here again. Now there are 6 screws that you need to remove here, so let's get to it. It's important to note that the 2 screws at the top of the base enclosure are longer than the other 4 screws. Now, you'll notice that I'm using the tweezers to grab the screws. That's just to make them easier to grab. You don't have to. And some screwdrivers may even have a magnetic pull, so you won't need to use the tweezers. Almost there. Just one more. And there you go. Put the tools down. Okay, so we've got the screws removed. Now we need to approach it from the other side. So turn it over and open the Chromebook until it's flat on the workbench, with the keyboard deck in front of you. Now the idea is to prise the top cover with keyboard away from the base enclosure. So for that, you're going to need a tool. Specifically, you're going to need the non-metallic flat-bladed tool. So take it and carefully stick it in between the top cover with keyboard and base enclosure, and pull the tool all the way around the seam of the Chromebook. Hear that? Those popping noises? Don't be alarmed. It's just the clips disengaging from the top cover. As they say, keep calm and carry on. Now this part is a little tricky. You just have to take it all the way around. Just like that. There. Now, you'll need to fold the base enclosure to a 90-degree angle. and gently lift the top cover with keyboard up to about 45 degrees. And as you open up the top cover, you'll see that there are two cables that are connected to the system board, which you'll need to disconnect. Let me point these out for you. These are the touchpad ribbon cable and the keyboard ribbon cable. But before you disconnect these two cables, it's a good idea to always disconnect the battery cable first. So let's go ahead and do that right now. But hold on just 1 minute. As you can see, there is a large piece of transparent mylar tape that covers all three connectors. So let's go ahead and first peel this back. You can just use your hands. Pretty simple. And just peel it back so you can gain access to the connectors. Now pick up a pair of tweezers and remove the black mylar tape that covers the battery connector. Then grip the battery connector cable and free it from its socket, like this. Feel free to wiggle it out so you don't damage the connector. All right, great. On to the next cable. Use the same pair of tweezers to lift the locking bar up on the touchpad ribbon cable connector and grasp the cable and gently free it from its socket. Do the same for the keyboard ribbon cable. Lift up the locking bar, grab the cable with the tweezers, gently pull to remove. Okay, now remove the top cover with keyboard. Set the Chromebook to the side for now and place the top cover with keyboard down. Now that you have the top cover with keyboard in front of you, the next part you should remove is the touchpad. Flip the top cover with keyboard over and let's get started. It's always good to start by disconnecting the cable first. So grab the pair of tweezers next to you and peel back the transparent tape that covers the touchpad connector. Then gently lift the locking bar up on the connector, grip the cable, and pull it until it is free from its socket. It's as simple as that. Now there are a bunch of screws to remove here. 7 to be exact. There are 4 2mm P0 Phillips head screws for the touchpad bracket and 3 1.6mm P0 Phillips broadhead screws for the touchpad itself. Let's start by taking out the screws from the touchpad bracket first. With the screws now removed, lift the touchpad bracket up and off of its alignment pins with your hands and put it aside. You'll notice that the 3 screws that fix the touchpad to the top cover with keyboard are shielded by a big piece of transparent tape. You'll definitely need to peel back this tape so that you can remove the screws. So let's do that. Great. With that done, go ahead and remove the screws. Then, lift the touchpad off of its alignment pins and set it to the side. Now that you've removed the touchpad, put the top cover with keyboard to the side and bring back the Chromebook to continue with the next removal procedure. If you're still with us, so far we've removed the top cover with keyboard and touchpad. Let's tackle the speakers next. The first thing to notice is that the speaker cable is routed along the battery. Make sure to remember this routing channel for later. Let's see, what should we do first? Yes, let's disconnect the speaker cable. With your hands, carefully peel back the transparent tape that covers the speaker cable connector. Then, grab the needle nose pliers to disconnect the speaker cable from the system board. Good stuff. The cable is disconnected. Let's free the cable from the routing channel next. Starting from the right speaker, use the flat-bladed tool to carefully free the speaker cable from the routing channel along the battery. Excellent. Now we can move on to removing the screws. There are 4 3.5mm P1 Phillips head screws that secure the battery protection bracket to the battery and speakers. The bracket must be removed before the speakers can be removed. So let's go ahead and remove the screws. Okay, now that the screws have been removed, lift the battery protection bracket up and find a place for it near the other parts you've put aside. There's one more screw to remove for the speakers, tucked away just here. It's a 3.5mm P1 Phillips head screw. Let's quickly remove it. With all the screws removed, you can go ahead and lift the speakers off of their alignment pins on the base enclosure and set them to one side. It's time to remove the battery, which should be easy as there are no screws to remove or cables to disconnect. It's always a good idea to use caution when removing the battery. Make sure you don't puncture, twist, or crack the battery. Any internal puncture or rupture to the battery has the potential to cause a short, which may result in a thermal event. With the screws already removed and set aside, lift the battery off of its alignment pins on the base enclosure and put it aside. So where should we focus our attention next? The Hall sensor board seems like a good component to remove. Let's do that procedure next. By now, I'm sure you're familiar with the transparent tape on the system board that covers the various connectors. Use your hands and gently peel back the tape that covers the Hall sensor board connector. Nice. Now we'll have access to the connector. Using the flat-bladed tool, lift up the locking bar on the Hall sensor board connector on the system board. You can use your hands for this next bit. Gently pull the Hall sensor board ribbon cable until it comes free from the connector. Make sure you also remove the cable from the adhesive that secures it to the base enclosure to avoid damaging the cable. Now that the cable's done, let's turn our attention to the screw. A single P1 Phillips head screw secures the Hall sensor board to the base enclosure. Pick up your Phillips screwdriver with the P1 head and remove the screw. And now to complete this procedure. Gently grab the edges of the Hall sensor board with the cable attached. Lift it up and place it in a convenient space close by. Okay, pay close attention to this next removal procedure for the system board, as it's one of the more tricky ones. Just like we've done for the other procedures so far, let's start by disconnecting the cables. There are two cables you're going to have to disconnect. These are the webcam cable and display panel cable. For the webcam cable, first peel back the mylar tape that secures the cable to the system board. Now, pick up those pliers and gently tug on the webcam cable to disconnect it. Then, use your hands to peel back the transparent tape on the system board that covers the display panel cable connector and the wireless LAN module. Next up, remove the second piece of tape that secures the display panel cable to the system board. Lift the locking bar up on the connector and gently pull the cable until it comes free from its socket. Now that we've got the cables out of the way, let's move on to the screws. Start by removing the P1 Phillips head screw that secures the wireless LAN bracket to the system board. Now pick up the bracket that covers the wireless module and put it to the side. Now, onto the next bracket. Remove the two P1 Phillips head screws that secure the USB-C bracket to the system board. Lift up the bracket and place it to the side. Now, you need to disconnect the wireless antenna cables from the wireless module using a pair of needle nose pliers. But be very careful when disconnecting the wireless antenna cables, as a damaged cable or connector can hurt Chromebook performance. I'm glad that part is over with. Now let's focus on the last two screws. Grab your Phillips screwdriver with a P1 head and remove the two P1 Phillips head screws. Great. Now, go ahead and grasp the left edge of the system board. Lift it up slightly, and then lift it off of its alignment pins. With the system board almost free, guide the external connectors out of the cutouts in the base enclosure. Once the system board is completely free, put the Chromebook to the side and place the system board down on the anti-static mat. The next procedure we'll be doing is the heatsink removal. You're probably wondering why I've asked you to put the system board down in front of you. Well, turn the system board around to find out. As you can see, the heatsink is on the other side of the system board. There are no cables to disconnect here, so let's move straight to the screws. Grab your Phillips screwdriver with a P0 head and remove the two P0 Phillips broadhead screws. Then, put the screwdriver and tweezers down and grab the heatsink by the edges and pull gently to separate it from the system board. Once it's free, go ahead and place it to the side along with the system board. The next removal procedure for the hinge cap is a quick and easy one, so let's get straight to it. First, grab the Chromebook and open it fully, as this will allow you to freely access the hinge cap. Next, use your fingers to gently squeeze the hinge cap until you hear popping sounds. These sounds tell you that the hinge cap has been removed from the clips on the base enclosure. Now that the hinge cap has been removed from the retention clips, slide the hinge cap off of the display panel hinges and put it down with the other removed parts on the table. Brace yourself for another tricky procedure, the base enclosure removal. There are quite a few cables to unroute, so let's begin there. Be sure to remember the different routing channels for later. Now here's a hot tip. If you'd like, you can take a picture of the routing channels with your phone to help you remember them. Now let's identify the cables we're going to remove. They are the display panel cable, wireless antenna cables, and webcam cable. Go ahead and remove these cables from their routing channel on the base enclosure. And now for the screws. Grab your Phillips screwdriver with a P1 head and remove the 4 screws that secure the display panel hinges to the base enclosure. Okay, now for the tricky part. With one hand, take hold of the display enclosure, and with the other hand, grab the base enclosure. Now partially fold them towards each other. Then, carefully remove the right display panel hinge from under the lip on the base enclosure. And then, the left display panel hinge. Once the base enclosure is free, slide it to the side and put the display enclosure down on the table in front of you. Now that we're dealing with just the display enclosure, what part do you think we should remove first? If you guessed the display bezel, you're spot on. Grab the flat-bladed, non-metallic tool and place it between the display bezel and the display panel. And then, carefully, start separating the edges of the display bezel from the top, the sides, and the bottom of the display enclosure. Please, work very carefully, as the last thing you want to do is scratch or crack the display panel screen, or even break the display bezel, which is often very thin and not very robust. Nice and easy. There you go. Once the display bezel is free from the adhesive, gently lift it up and put it to the side. Let's keep it rolling with our next removal procedure, the display panel. You'll notice that the removal of the display bezel revealed that there are some screws to remove for the panel. So let's begin there. Pick up your Phillips screwdriver with a P0 head and remove the 4 screws that secure the display panel to the display enclosure. Two more. Okay, last one. Great. With the screws removed, gently pick up the display panel and place it face down in front of the display enclosure. Now be careful when lifting up the display panel, as you can very easily scratch the screen on one of the display panel hinges, or you could accidentally tear the display panel cable if you use too much force. You'll see here that the display panel cable is connected to the back of the display panel. So to disconnect the cable, start by using your hands to remove the metallic mylar tape. Then lift the locking bar up on the ZIF connector and pull the cable out of its socket. With the display panel free, lift it up and set it to the side. And now for another nice and easy procedure. The LCD bracket removal. There really isn't much to this one, except for a few screws. So let's start there. Grab your trusty Phillips screwdriver with a P0 head. And remove the two 3mm Phillips head screws that secure the LCD bracket to the display enclosure. Put the screwdriver down, grab the LCD bracket, and lift it off of its alignment pins. Once free, place it next to you. And now, onto the webcam board removal procedure. Fortunately for us, it's pretty simple, so let's waste no time. The very first thing you need to do is peel back the tape that covers the webcam board ZIF connector. I'd recommend using a pair of tweezers to do this, as the tape is very small and hard to clutch with your fingers. With the tape removed, go ahead and disconnect the webcam ribbon cable from the webcam board. Then, put the tweezers down and pick up the flat-bladed non-metallic tool. Use the tool to gently prise the webcam board from the adhesive that secures it to the display enclosure. Now that the webcam board has been freed from the adhesive, lift it off of its alignment pins and set it to the side. We're getting close to the end of this teardown, so let's finish strong. The next removal procedure for the display panel hinges is a pretty easy one, so let's jump right in. In total, there are 6 P1 Phillips broadhead screws that secure the display panel hinges to the display enclosure. 3 screws for each hinge. Grab the Phillips screwdriver with a P1 head, and let's take these out. That's one hinge down. Last one. And there you go. Now all you have to do is simply lift the left display panel hinge off of its alignment pins and put it to the side. Follow the same instructions for the right display panel hinge. And there you go. It's as easy as that. We're so close to the end now. Just 2 more procedures. This next removal procedure for the display panel cable is very basic. There really isn't much to it. You're going to want to start by grabbing your needle nose pliers and lifting up the adhesive tape that holds the display panel cable to the display enclosure. Then, remove the display panel cable from the routing channel on the display enclosure. Make sure to remember the routing channel for later. Now that the cable is free, you can simply place it to the side with the rest of the removed components. And just like that, we've arrived at the last removal procedure for the webcam cable. Great job on making it this far. Now, on to the procedure. As you can see, the webcam cable is routed all the way along the left side of the display enclosure. Please do remember this routing channel for later. And like the hot tip we mentioned earlier, take a picture of it with your phone if you'd like, for a reference when we replace it. Go ahead and remove the webcam cable from its routing channel. Lift it off of the display enclosure and put it to the side. We made it to the finish line. It's been a pleasure tearing down this unit with you. I do hope you'll stick around for the replacement procedures. Welcome back, everybody. I'm going to be helping you put this brand new Chromebook, the HP Chromebook 11MK G9 Education Edition, back together. If you've just joined us from the removal procedures, you should have all the components for the Chromebook neatly tucked away to one side of your workbench or table. Now, before we begin with the replacement procedures, let's have a quick refresher on the tools you'll need. But before we do, I'm just going to change views here so that you can get a better look. There you go, much better. Now, for this Chromebook, you'll need a Phillips screwdriver with a P0 and P1 head, a flat-bladed non-metallic tool, tweezers, needle nose pliers, thermal grease, and a thermal grease applicator, surgical spirits, and a cotton swab. And a wooden stick. Before we begin with the replacement procedures, let's switch back to the overhead view to get a better sense of where to start. So, quick quiz. What was the last component we removed from this Chromebook? Anyone? That's right, it's the webcam cable. So let's start by replacing it first. Make sure you have the display enclosure in front of you. So let's go ahead and grab the webcam cable and route it through its routing channel. Don't feel the need to rush this step. We'd rather make sure the cable is correctly routed before continuing. There you go. One replacement procedure down. Now, on to the next one. The next replacement procedure is for another cable, the display panel cable. And fortunately for us, it's another easy one. So let's get going. Grab the display panel cable you set aside and route it through the routing channel at the bottom of the display enclosure. And don't forget to press down on the tape that fixes the display panel cable to the display enclosure. Now that we've got those two cables replaced, let's move on to the next replacement procedure, which is for the display panel hinges. These should be near to hand, so pick up the two hinges and place them onto the alignment pins on the display enclosure. Now don't worry if they move around a bit. Remember, we still have to secure them with the screws. So go ahead and grab your Phillips screwdriver with a P1 head and replace the 6 screws that hold the display panel hinges in place. Remember, no special order is needed with these. Just make sure that each screw is secure. You see, now they're firmly in place, and we can move on to the next replacement procedure. Now, those first 3 procedures just flew by. Let's keep things moving with the next replacement procedure for the webcam board. Pick up the webcam board you removed earlier and put it over its alignment pins on the display enclosure. Before we move on to reconnecting the cable, lightly press down on the webcam board to make sure it is stuck to the display enclosure. There you go. Next, grab your favorite needle nose pliers and reconnect the webcam cable to the webcam board. Now, the cable's pretty small, so it may take you a few tries until it's properly connected. And don't forget to replace the tape that covers the webcam cable connector. We wouldn't want the cable to wiggle free from its socket, would we? With the cable secure, we're good to go with the next replacement procedure. We're about a third of the way through the replacement procedures already. Great work so far. Let's keep up the good work with this next replacement procedure for the LCD bracket. Grab the LCD bracket next to you and place it onto its alignment pins. Now, let's see what screws we're dealing with here. I remember now. There are 2 3mm P0 Phillips head screws that secure the LCD bracket to the display enclosure. Oh, the screw organizer is definitely going to save some time searching for the correct screws. Go ahead and grab your Phillips screwdriver with a P0 head and replace these screws. That was very quick and easy, but get ready because the next replacement procedure is not as simple. Can you guess what procedure it is? If you guessed display panel, well done. This procedure is a little trickier than most, but it's really just a few extra steps, no problem for you. Start by picking up the display panel and putting it in front of the display enclosure. But remember, make sure it's upside down so that you can reconnect the display panel cable. And the other thing is, you definitely want to be a little careful when doing this because you don't want to scratch the display panel screen. Okay, with the display panel connector now close enough to the display panel cable, use your hands to reconnect the cable. And then push the locking bar down. Once that's done, smooth over the tape with your fingers. This will help make sure the cable doesn't go anywhere. Carefully flip the display panel over and place it inside the display enclosure. Now we can turn our attention to the screws. There are 4 3mm P0 Phillips head screws in total for the display panel. Grab your Phillips screwdriver with a P0 head and replace these screws. Well done on getting through that one with me. Let's keep the ball rolling with the next replacement procedure. The next procedure for the display bezel is a fairly easy one, as there are no screws to replace or cables to connect. So let's get started. Grab the display bezel you put aside and place it into position on the display enclosure. Using your hands, gently push down along the edges of the display bezel to put it back into place. Now, before moving on to the next procedure, just make sure that the display bezel is flush to the display enclosure. There shouldn't be any visible gaps or openings. All right, looks good to me. Let's move on. We're back with another tricky replacement procedure, this time for the base enclosure. Are you ready? Let's do this. Start by making sure the display panel hinges are rotated outwards at approximately 135 degrees. Then, grab the base enclosure and put it in front of the display panel assembly. Now, lift the base enclosure and display panel assembly and rotate them towards each other like this. With the base enclosure and display panel assembly close enough together, it's now a lot easier to guide the display panel hinges into their slots on the base enclosure. Start by guiding the right display panel hinge into its slot, and make sure it's positioned over its screw wells on the base enclosure. Once the right display panel hinge is in, do the exact same thing for the left one. Now all you need to do is grab the hinges and gently open the Chromebook. Great work. Now we can move on to the screws. There are 4 screws in total that secure the display panel hinges to the base enclosure. 2 per hinge. Grab your Phillips screwdriver with a P1 head and replace the screws. The last bit of this is to route the cables through their routing channel on the base enclosure. This includes the display panel cable, the wireless antenna cables, and the webcam cable. Make sure to route the cables through their correct routing channel. And feel free to do this at your own pace. And there you go. That's it for the base enclosure. Let's see which part we'll replace next. Okay, with the base enclosure and display panel assembly reattached, it's time to replace the hinge cap. And good news, it's pretty easy to do. Grab the hinge cap and put it over the display panel hinges. Apply some pressure to the hinge cap to snap it back into place. You should hear popping sounds, which tells you that the hinge cap has been secured correctly. There you go. Pretty easy, right? Now let's move on to replacing the parts inside the base enclosure. The first part to replace inside the base enclosure is the heatsink. There's not much to it, but you're going to need a few special items, like thermal grease, surgical spirits, and a cotton swab. So make sure you have these handy. You might remember the heatsink was attached to the underside of the system board. So start off by sliding the Chromebook to the side. Then grab the heatsink and system board and place them down on the anti-static mat. You'll probably notice that there's some thermal grease on the processor and heatsink. The thermal grease should be wiped off and new thermal grease should be applied every time the heatsink is removed. So go ahead and grab the surgical spirits and cotton swab and lightly dab the swab in the alcohol solution. Then clean all thermal grease off of the heatsink and processor. Next up, grab the thermal grease applicator and apply a small amount of thermal grease to the processor. You don't need much. The processor is pretty small. Now that we got that out of the way, place the heatsink over its screw wells on the system board and gently press down. You may feel the heatsink slide a bit, but the grease will keep it in place. Perfect. Now onto the screws. You'll see that there are 2 screws to replace here. So grab your Phillips screwdriver with a P0 head and replace them. The heatsink should now be secured to the system board. Maybe give the system board a little shake to make sure the heatsink doesn't move. All right, looks good to me. Let's move on to the next procedure. So you should already have the system board in front of you, which works out perfectly as this is the next replacement procedure. Start off by grabbing the Chromebook and placing it in front of you. Then pick up the system board and turn it around so that the external connectors are on the right side of the system board. Now, guide these connectors into the cutouts in the base enclosure and lower the system board onto its alignment pins. You're going to want to be pretty careful when lowering the system board, and you don't want to trap or damage any of the cables underneath it. All right, great. The hard part is done. Let's turn our attention to the screws. There are 2 P1 Phillips head screws that secure the system board to the base enclosure. Grab your Phillips screwdriver and replace these screws. Now, it will be a good idea to reconnect the wireless antenna cables. You may have to peel back the transparent tape that covers the wireless module to do so if necessary. Then, reconnect the wireless antenna cables to the wireless LAN module, but be careful when reconnecting, as a damaged cable or connector can damage the Chromebook's performance. I usually like to use a pair of needle nose pliers and the back end of my wooden stick to do this, but you can do whatever feels easiest. Once those cables are reconnected, grab the wireless LAN bracket and put it over the wireless LAN module. You'll notice that there is a screw to replace here. Pick up your faithful Phillips screwdriver with the P1 head and replace the screw. And now for the next bracket. Place the USB-C bracket over its screw wells on the system board. Now here, you'll need to replace two P1 Phillips head screws. Grab your screwdriver again and replace those screws. Now that all the screws have been replaced, we can focus on reconnecting the cables. Let's see, which cable should we start with? Why don't we start with the webcam cable? Pick up your needle nose pliers and carefully reconnect the webcam cable to the system board. Then, with your fingers, smooth over the mylar tape that secures the cable. And now for the display panel cable. If necessary, peel back the transparent mylar that covers the display panel cable connector. Clutch the cable with your fingers and reconnect it to the system board. Don't forget to push the locking bar down and smooth over the mylar tape that secures the cable. And make sure to press down on the larger piece of mylar tape that covers the display panel cable ZIF connector and the wireless LAN module. Great work! But before we move on to the next procedure, make sure to press down on the larger piece of transparent mylar that covers the system board. Perfect. Let's move on. It's time for the next replacement procedure, which will be for the hall sensor board. There's a little complexity to this one, but don't be discouraged. Start off by grabbing the hall sensor board, with the cable attached, and place it over its alignment pins on the base enclosure. Now, if you're installing a new hall sensor board, instead of just replacing the old one, you will need to remove the cable from the old hall sensor board and connect it to the new hall sensor board. And now for that single screw. Remember, there's one P1 Phillips head screw that secures the hall sensor board to the base enclosure. Grab your Phillips screwdriver and replace the screw. Next, press down on the hall sensor board ribbon cable to adhere it to the base enclosure. Then, make sure the large piece of transparent tape on the system board is peeled back before reconnecting the hall sensor board ribbon cable. And don't forget to smooth over the tape if you did have to peel it back. There you go. The hall sensor board has been replaced. Let's kick on with the next procedure. Now it's time to replace one of the most important components in any PC, the battery. Grab the battery next to you and place it over its alignment pins on the base enclosure. Please be very careful when doing so, and take care not to puncture, twist, or crack the battery. An internal puncture or rupture to the battery has the potential to cause a short, which may result in a thermal event. Remember, there are no screws to replace for the battery yet, and that's because the battery protection bracket still needs to be installed, and that can only be done after installing the speakers, which, funnily enough, is the next procedure. We're getting close to the end of the replacement procedures. Outstanding work so far. Let's keep up the good momentum with the next replacement procedure for the speakers. Grab the speakers you placed near to hand and put them onto their alignment pins on the base enclosure. At this point, it's a good idea to replace the one P1 Phillips head screw that secures the right speaker to the base enclosure. Grab your Phillips screwdriver and replace this screw. Now, it's at this stage that you can go ahead and place the battery protection bracket over its alignment pins. There are 4 more P1 Phillips head screws that secure the battery protection bracket and battery to the base enclosure. Pick up your Phillips screwdriver again and replace these screws. Now, as you can see, because this has also secured the speakers, go ahead and route the speaker cable into the routing channel along the bottom of the battery. Then, grab your needle nose pliers, gently grasp the speaker cable, and reconnect it to its connector on the system board. You may need to peel back the transparent tape to do so, and if you do, just make sure to smooth over the tape once you've reconnected the cable. All right, only 2 more procedures left. Let's finish off strong here. The second last replacement procedure is the touchpad. For this procedure, you're going to need the top cover with keyboard. So let's bring the top cover with keyboard back and place it face down. You can place the Chromebook to the side for now. Then, pick up the touchpad, and while holding the Mylar back, place it into its cutout in the top cover. Perfect. And now for the screws. There are 3 P0 Phillips broadhead screws that secure the touchpad to the top cover. Grab your Phillips screwdriver with its P0 head and replace these screws. Then, simply smooth over the Mylar tape that shields the screws on the touchpad. Now, pick up the touchpad bracket and place it over the touchpad. There are also some other screws to replace here. So, grab your Phillips screwdriver again and replace the 4 P0 Phillips head screws that secure the touchpad bracket to the top cover. Once all screws have been replaced, you can go ahead and reconnect the touchpad ribbon cable to the touchpad. Remember to push the locking bar down. And smooth over the Mylar tape that covers the connector. With the touchpad replaced, let's move on to the last replacement procedure. We have now arrived at the last replacement procedure. Destination, the top cover with keyboard. Well done on making it this far. Let's finish strong. Start off by flipping the top cover with keyboard around and place the Chromebook in front of you. Then, grab the base enclosure and rotate it to a 90-degree angle. This next part is a little tricky, so don't rush it here. Place the top cover with keyboard near the hinges in the base enclosure. And hold it at an angle where you can quite easily see inside the unit. This will make it easier to reconnect the cables. You'll see that there are 3 cables that must be reconnected to the system board. These are the battery connector cable, the keyboard ribbon cable, and touchpad board ribbon cable. Now make sure the transparent mylar tape that covers all 3 connectors is peeled back. Okay, let's start with the keyboard ribbon cable. Pick up your needle nose pliers, grab the cable, and reconnect it to the system board. Don't forget to push the locking bar down. Then do the same for the touchpad ribbon cable. Finally, grasp the edges of the battery connector cable and carefully reconnect it to its connector on the system board. And then, this is important, don't forget to replace the black mylar tape that secures the battery connector cable. Perfect. Before we move on to the next step, make sure the piece of transparent mylar that covers the system board is smoothed over. Okay, looks good. You can put the Chromebook down now. Next, open the Chromebook fully and lower the top cover with keyboard down. Gently apply some pressure along the edges to snap the top cover back into place. Now you can go ahead and close the Chromebook and turn it upside down so that the base enclosure is facing you. It's time to replace the last set of screws. There are 6 screws to replace, 2 8mm P1 Phillips head screws, and 4 7mm P1 Phillips head screws. Remember that it's the 2 screws at the top of the base enclosure that are slightly longer than the rest. Grab your Phillips screwdriver and let's get to work. And there you have it. We are officially done with putting this Chromebook back together. Well done, everyone. I hope that you found these replacement procedures helpful. It was certainly a blast for me. Until next time.